The mirrors of Topkapi Palace never forget. Tonight they reflect 280 faces, terrified, glistening in torchlight. Within an hour, every one of them will vanish beneath the Bosporus. Not because of war, not rebellion, because one man, the Sultan of an empire, has lost his mind. This is the night the Ottoman court became a slaughterhouse, and love, faith, and reason drowned with the women who once called it home. You're about to witness how absolute power turned a palace into a cage, and how the man history calls Ibrahim the Mad proved that madness, when crowned, becomes law. The year is 1640. The Ottoman throne stands empty for the first time in years. Murad IV, the iron-fisted ruler who crushed rebellions and outlawed coffee, has died without an heir. And deep within the palace, behind a door that had not been opened for decades, a trembling voice whispers from the dark. That voice belongs to Ibrahim, the last surviving prince of the royal bloodline. For most of his life, he has known only one room, the cafes, the cage. It is not a metaphor. It is a windowless prison built inside Topkapi Palace, designed to keep potential heirs from challenging the throne. No sunlight, no freedom, only silence, guarded whispers, and the echo of footsteps that meant death for someone else. From childhood, Ibrahim watched his brothers taken out one by one, never to return. Each execution reminded him that survival meant invisibility. He learned to breathe quietly, speak softly, and never attract attention. His sanity became a fragile thread stretched across years of isolation. So when palace officials arrived to tell him, "You are the Sultan now," Ibrahim refused to believe them. He thought it was a trick, one more cruel test before the inevitable bowstring tightened around his neck. It took hours of pleading before he stepped out of that cell, but the man who emerged was not a ruler. He was a ghost wearing royal robes. Power for Ibrahim was not liberation, it was a relapse. Years of fear had twisted his mind into something brittle and paranoid. He could not trust his own family, his advisors, or even his reflection. The cage had been physical once, but now it lived inside him. And the empire would soon feel what happens when the most powerful man in the world rules with the mind of a prisoner. When Ibrahim finally took his seat on the Ottoman throne, he inherited not just an empire but a machine built on control. At its center stood the imperial harem, the most secretive institution in the known world. From the outside, it shimmered with elegance, marble courtyards, perfumed corridors, and women draped in silk. But beneath that beauty lay a system as cold and calculated as any battlefield. The harem was not a place of love or luxury. It was an empire within an empire, 400 rooms, more than 1,000 women, and a hierarchy maintained by fear. Every girl brought through its gates entered as property. Many were captured from distant Christian villages, taken during wars or through the Ottoman Devshirme system. Some were barely 6 years old, chosen for their beauty or the symmetry of their faces. They were trained in languages, music, dance, and what Ottoman records called the arts of pleasing. A lifetime of grooming designed not to educate, but to erase the self. Every gesture, every smile, every word a concubine spoke was observed, ranked, and recorded. The purpose was simple: to mold obedience, to turn women into reflections of the Sultan's desires rather than beings of their own. By the time Ibrahim inherited this system, it had already perfected the science of submission. But Ibrahim did not want order. He wanted proof that he was free, proof that he could control the very souls of those around him. And so the palace that had once been a place of whispers and discipline became a theater. The mirrors were polished, the lights arranged, the audience only one man. He began holding what palace documents later called evening entertainments. But they were not entertainments at all. They were performances of pain. The courtiers who served him described a change in his eyes, a kind of glittering fascination, when he realized that fear itself could be art. The mirrored halls of Topkapi Palace were about to become the stage where Ibrahim's madness would find its voice. The transformation began quietly. At first, courtiers whispered that the Sultan was merely seeking diversion, a lonely ruler indulging in palace games. But what unfolded inside those halls was not entertainment. It was ritualized degradation. Ibrahim ordered mirrors to be installed across the walls of the inner chambers, ceiling to floor, every surface reflecting back infinity. The reason, he said, was to see beauty from every angle. But what he created was a labyrinth of reflection, where the condemned could watch their own terror multiply 1,000-fold. Here, in the flicker of oil lamps, began the competitions. Naked concubines were forced to run through the gardens, their feet bruised against the marble paths while Ibrahim watched from a raised pavilion. The winner would be chosen not for grace but for fear. He wanted to see which one trembled, which one cried, which one tried to appear brave. Each emotion became part of the performance. The victors were taken aside, rewarded with what the records euphemistically call audience with the Sultan. The others were punished, or used again the next night. Contemporary observers, like Dmitri Kantemir, wrote that Ibrahim's madness was not chaotic. It was structured. Every detail was planned: the lighting, the music, even the sequence of the punishments. He treated the harem like an experiment, testing how far he could push the human mind before it shattered. The eunuchs, themselves mutilated victims of the same imperial system, were forced to organize these horrors. They prepared the rooms, bathed the women, and took notes for the palace archives. For Ibrahim, this was more than cruelty. It was validation. He had been powerless all his life, and now he could command the universe inside those mirrored walls. He could make them laugh, cry, beg at will. The reflections were proof that his power was real, and every scream that echoed back reminded him that he was no longer the boy in the cage. But each night his hunger grew darker. The performances would soon evolve, no longer games of beauty, but carefully designed rituals of psychological destruction. By the mid-1640s, Ibrahim's so-called competitions had become the empire's most closely guarded secret. Every session was planned like a royal ceremony. Lists of names, categories of performance, and detailed reports of behavioral response. In the bureaucratic handwriting of the Ottoman archives, cruelty had found its paperwork. There were the races of grace, where terrified women sprinted across marble courtyards while eunuchs timed their speed. The games of obedience, where concubines were forced to dance naked, stopping only when Ibrahim clapped his hands. And the tests of temperament, where he would walk among them, touching faces, whispering threats, measuring who dared to meet his eyes. Those who looked away too soon were branded cowards. Those who met his gaze too long, defiant. Both were punished. Witnesses wrote that Ibrahim's pleasure came not from the body, but from the breaking of the spirit. He called these sessions refinements of discipline. To him, fear was art, control was ecstasy. Even his eunuchs were prisoners of this logic. Castrated as children, trained for absolute obedience, they became the machinery of his madness. They recorded attendance, adjusted lighting, documented injuries. In their ledgers, the screams of women became numbers in neat Ottoman script, dates, times, and remarks on condition. Each night's spectacle grew more elaborate. The Sultan demanded costumes, props, and choreographed humiliations. He ordered special mirrors angled to reflect every expression of pain, every tear glinting under torchlight. The women began to fear the sight of their own faces. Ibrahim's mind deteriorated further. He began believing he was not a man at all, but a divine stallion, neighing during the rituals, convinced he was channeling some mythical power. What had begun as secret indulgence now devoured the empire's focus. Craftsmen built new chambers for his games, while scribes compiled manuals of procedure to ensure they met his satisfaction. In the heart of one of the world's most powerful empires, an entire bureaucratic system had reorganized itself around a single man's delusion, and no one dared to stop him, because to question the Sultan's pleasure was treason. By now, the palace had become a workshop for Ibrahim's mind, each chamber an extension of his fantasies. He no longer saw the women of the harem as people, but as props in an endless stage play. His commands grew stranger, his rituals more dangerous, and the eunuchs, terrified of execution, obeyed them all. He began combining sexual ritual with physical torture. Women were ordered to perform even when sick or bleeding. Those who stumbled were beaten, then made to bow before the mirrors that multiplied their agony. Palace doctors treated the wounds in silence, recording only expenses in the ledgers: broken ribs, crushed fingers, fever deaths, all reduced to numbers beside the cost of perfumes and silk. Each new spectacle sought to outdo the last. Ibrahim designed themes for his performances. One night he declared himself Zeus, ruler of gods, and forced the women to play goddesses competing for his favor. He demanded thunder sounds, costumes of gold thread, and scenes reenacted from myth, except every act of worship ended in humiliation. He laughed as the women wept through their rehearsed lines. Convinced he was reliving divine history, artisans and tailors were dragged into this madness. Blacksmiths built devices meant for discipline. Seamstresses stitched clothing intended to expose and degrade. The empire's finest craftsmen, once responsible for building mosques and palaces, now created instruments of torment, because their sultan commanded it. And still, his hunger for spectacle grew. He wanted witnesses. Ibrahim began inviting ambassadors, generals, even religious scholars to his performances, calling them proof of Ottoman glory. Foreign envoys sat frozen in disbelief as the Sultan conducted his horrors in full view. A French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Tavier, wrote home in code, his letters describing scenes too obscene for daylight. Venetian traders refused to negotiate unless the shows stopped. They never did. Behind the silks and gold, the empire itself was beginning to rot. Administrators ignored their duties to serve Ibrahim's entertainments. Armies went unpaid. Taxes vanished into palace spectacles, and yet no one spoke because silence was survival. The Sultan's mind had broken completely, and now his madness was no longer private. It was policy. By 1648, the palace had become a living nightmare. What began as whispered fear now filled every corner of Topkapi with silent obedience. Even the sound of footsteps carried dread. The Sultan no longer ruled an empire, he ruled suspicion. Ibrahim's paranoia devoured him from within. He became convinced that the women were plotting against him, sending secret signals, laughing at him behind those mirrored walls. He ordered that no concubine should speak to another without permission. The harem, once alive with music, fell into suffocating quiet. Women lived in isolation cells, emerging only for the competitions. But the human spirit, even crushed, finds ways to resist. Hidden among the silks and perfumes, a network began to form, a language of survival. A glance across a corridor could mean safe. A misplaced hairpin in a costume could carry a warning. They risked everything just to whisper hope. Outside those halls, the empire was collapsing. Trade slowed. Soldiers deserted. Diplomats refused to enter Constantinople. And still Ibrahim's focus remained on the harem. His mother, Ottoman Sultan, once his protector, finally saw that her son's insanity had endangered the entire dynasty. But to confront him meant death, and she had seen enough executions to know the outcome. Then came the final act. One summer night, a rumor reached Ibrahim's ears. A concubine had been unfaithful. The story was likely false, but in his fractured mind it confirmed every fear, every whisper he thought he'd heard in the dark. In a frenzy, he ordered all 280 women of his harem bound, their bodies sealed in weighted sacks. By torchlight, soldiers dragged them through the palace gardens down toward the Bosporus. One by one they were thrown into the water, muffled screams swallowed by the tide. Only one survived, her bindings loosening as she sank, pulled from the current by a passing French ship. Her testimony years later would expose what the empire tried to bury. The next morning, Topkapi Palace was silent. Even the eunuchs refused to meet one another's eyes. For the first time, Ibrahim stood truly alone, surrounded by mirrors that now reflected nothing but ghosts. The drowning broke more than the hearts of the palace. It broke the illusion of divine rule. For 8 years, the Ottoman Empire had endured Ibrahim's delusions, but the night the Bosporus turned into a graveyard, even his most loyal guards saw the truth. The Sultan had become the empire's disease. Within days, whispers spread through the corridors of Topkapi. The Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, began to murmur of rebellion. The Grand Vizier gathered support from court officials. And the Sheikh al-Islam, the highest religious authority, issued a decree that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The ruler has lost reason. His command is no longer law. The rebellion was bloodless but not merciful. One dawn in August 1648, Ibrahim was seized inside his mirrored chamber. He shouted that he was the true god of thunder, that lightning would strike anyone who touched him. But the thunder never came. The same bowstring that had silenced his brothers was drawn around his neck. The executioners worked quickly as tradition required. No blood of royalty was to be spilled. When it was done, The mirrors stood cracked and smeared with the smoke of extinguished torches. The Sultan of Madness was gone, yet what remained was far worse than legend. Because Ibrahim's reign wasn't simply the story of a madman, it was the story of a system that allowed madness to rule. Every atrocity had been recorded, filed, and stamped by the empire's bureaucracy. Every act of cruelty had a witness who said nothing. In the archives of Istanbul, those records still exist, pages of measured handwriting describing unmeasurable horror. They remind us that evil rarely announces itself with screams. It often walks in through routine, disguised as protocol, signed by secretaries, and obeyed by men who convince themselves they have no choice. The mirrors of Topkapi still hang in those halls today. If you stand before them long enough, you might see more than your reflection. You might see how civilization collapses not with fire or invasion, but when people stop questioning power. Because when madness sits on the throne, silence becomes the empire's greatest sin.